Tom looked critically at the boxes arrayed on his bed. Weaver had finished the outfits and arranged for morning delivery. True to her word, the delivery came before mid-morning, leaving a few minutes before he needed to meet with Pranara and Tyrrell. Carrying the parcels back into his bedroom, it felt a little like Christmas. As for quality, Weaver would have done any Hong Kong tailor proud, and even allowed time for, how had she put it, adjustment of fit to compensate for sartorial inexactitude. It was the most obscure way he'd ever heard someone say, in case you change your mind, but given how Weaver had measured him in seconds, possibly nanoseconds, the prospect of the suits being a bad fit wasn't likely. Style, on the other hand. After an initial consultation, where Weaver explained she had his measurements on site, the bulk of the appointment had been discussing what he wanted made. 2 bespoke suits, one for a formal evening out and something more casual for leisure events. For the former, it had been an enlightening conversation. Shilvanti, formal, for anyone who had served in the military, was one step shy of a Roman legionary's full armor, except possibly less comfortable. For civilians without prior military time, and after his time in the Air Force that notion rankled, formal wear currently in fashion was something more akin to a severely cut Nehru jacket that ended just above the knees, thigh-high Turok skin boots that would have done a musketeer proud, and leggings, optional. He'd opted for the damn leggings. As for smart casual, fit for social occasions, well, he wanted to make some kind of amends to Mivere, so he'd let her make the choices with Weaver in the back room. It seemed like a small concession, given how infrequently he'd wear the thing. It seemed innocent enough, and it felt as if some of the ice had thawed. The distance between them still felt wider than it ought to. Staring down at the 2 garment boxes, he sighed and pulled open the left one. The formal jacket lay there, resplendent in deep forest green, with gold trim discreetly at the cuffs. A lace cravat lay just on top. It was the Pelavon colours, another concession to Miss Sensibilities. He wouldn't normally be caught dead looking that much like Prince. In a room where everyone was wearing the same thing, what was the harm? Unless we break up. Tom shoved the thought back down into a hole. Garnier wasn't happy with him, but Miv was understanding. Having been on shore for less than 1 semester, he knew that the bulk of his actions had to be reflecting on her. That had kept him from speaking his mind more than once, and he'd gotten damn lucky with the Rochers. But there has to be a limit. Dropping the first box back on the bed, he reached down and drew open the other. All right, I feel violated. Tyrrell. Tom rose as the Helcom woman approached his table. Thank you for coming out to meet with me. Of course. You're the one who got all of this moving. She settled down into the chair opposite and studied his face. Tomorrow is the big day, after all. Is it? Tom settled back and studied her. I just took a look at the DataNet site you shared with me. You posted things just since yesterday that I never agreed to, and never would. You even used my picture without getting my permission. It's alright, really. It doesn't matter. It's just semantics. Tyrrell reached over for his hand and blinked when he pulled it sharply away. What's important is that we finally have a chance to make our point in a prominent venue. You're wrong. It matters. It matters rather a lot. Tom couldn't believe what he was hearing. It had all seemed so reasonable, up until he started reading this morning's posts. We talked all evening the other night, and there's no way that you thought I approved this, much less signed over my permission. Thomas, People can say they believe in the equality of the Imperium, but they don't actually do anything about it. She looked at him sympathetically, as if explaining something to a slow child. We need to strike a blow for what's right. As a human, you should understand that. What I understand is that there's a time and a place for dialogue, first. Not just hearing people talk, but listening to what they're saying. Tom shook his head dismissively and leaned back in his chair. Minister Earlyon has spent her career fighting for better education for everyone. I asked a reasonable question, hoping for a thoughtful answer, not to pillory or cast aspirations on the woman. That's why this really makes a statement. It's not enough to sit around, hoping for understanding forever. We have to do something for ourselves, Tyrell said earnestly. It's like Pranara says, when you're scenting blood, it's time to go for the kill. You know, you had me right up until you made this about revenge. Well, you can do it some other time, and some other way, and without me, he retorted coldly, setting his palms flat on the table. You're pulling those posts, Tyrell. The spam, all of it. Everything you have planned stops, and I mean right now. It's too late for that, Tom, she said soberly. I'm sorry, but I think you'll feel differently when you see what we can do. Oh, I've seen how that one goes. The ends justify the means. He sat back and rubbed his chin, regarding her warily. Are you sure you've never blown up a 7-Eleven? I'm sorry? She blinked in incomprehension and shook her head. I don't understand. Nothing. It doesn't matter. Tyrell, would you turn and look behind you, please? He leaned over to his left and nodded at her confusion, but she swiveled around to face the table behind her. A sextet of smiling faces looked back. I'd like you to meet Sarossi, Mreskep, Turai, Elri, and Jerethi. They're from the Academy Legal Department, and this is their friend, Lady Tenefree. She's a prosecutor from the Capital District Office, and I believe they'd very much like to talk to you. The Helcom turned just a shade greyer. Jama's office hadn't changed in the least. The dusty cabinets filled with inexplicable artifacts, treasures, and the clutter of a lifetime. As Minister of Education, she tried to reach so many living races within the Empire. Why did it feel like Jama was closer to the understanding with his study of the dead? As she pushed into the inner office, she saw the light at the open door. Canting her head to peer inside, Jam was pottering around his kettle. Piles of artifacts lay strewn about the office, in a way that only he understood, and she smiled. It had been years, and yet it seemed like only yesterday. He looked up when she pressed inside, the creak of the door giving her away. Well, I wondered when you'd get around to seeing me, he said severely, then grinned and strode over to wrap his arms about her. Rev, it's been far too long. Jama. She folded herself about him and closed her eyes for a moment. You haven't changed a bit. You didn't use such flattery with me when we were younger, he said, looking up. I'm doing well, but we're neither of us any younger. That's because you never needed it. Anyway, I meant that you still have your hand on my ass. Smirking, she disentangled herself and made her way into the office. It's nice to be expected, though. Ganya? She told me you were coming by, though I'd expect nothing less. Minister? Jama grinned fleetingly as he peered at her, then nodded at the kettle. Tea? I'm always Rev to you. And yes, please. She ran a hand along the back of the old leather chair and looked about. I'd have come by sooner, but events took an odd turn. Jama gave an undignified snort as he bustled over to the kettle. Ran into our young Professor Warwick, I hear. Yes, I did, she said. I've been walking around the campus today as well, talking to some of the girls. Is it true that Ganya had him teaching marriage fundamentals? And doing remarkably well, Jama chuckled wickedly. I remember both times I got asked to fill in, and I was scared to death. Really? Well, perhaps not that bad, but I'd wager my knees shook a wee bit. He poured 2 cups of tea with exaggerated care. He still remembered how she liked it, and she smiled wistfully as he brought them over and settled into the chair opposite her own. And now that you've been around campus? I know he's controversial, but he brings something vital to the students. She picked up the tea and blew across the top, watching the steam rise before arching a brow at him. You think I'm in the wrong on this whole business with my deputy ministers? For nearly 20 years you worked tirelessly for every species across the Imperium. You had the right to work how you thought best, and you've accomplished a great deal. Yes, well, the last thing I expected was to be challenged on my record. She blew on the tea again before taking a sip and grimaced. Still drinking Cambrian tea. It's good for you, just as I expect humans are good for us, and us for them, once everyone stops arsing around. They're more like us than any of the other races. I don't just mean in appearance. They're like us in ways none of the other races are. He took a sip of his own, and regarded her thoughtfully, almost disappearing into the recesses of his high-backed chair. You know, I remember when we tried to organize that gathering of species to demonstrate for rights. We were, what, 17? We didn't accomplish much, but it was a good day. She smirked at him. I think that's the first time you put your hand on my ass when no one was looking. Well, perhaps I did. Jama's eyes twinkled, but he looked at her earnestly. You've always been one to stand by your principles. So, what are they telling you now? All right, I think I have it. Kellock looked over the pieces before moving the marine 2 spaces forward. That's right, Professor Warwick nodded, as he looked to the board to move one of his own forward along the same line. Don't worry about winning the first game. I just want to give you an idea of how all the pieces move, and then we build on that. All right. Kellock studied the board all the same, looking at the pieces freed up along the back row. This isn't going to be as addictive as that cube, is it? Chess. It's a game, not a puzzle. Warwick looked up and raised his eyebrows. I suppose it depends on what you like. Scifi said I should give it a try, she said, watching as he moved a marine to support the first one. Where is she today? He asked, waving his hand. Around the room, Belder was playing one of the twins, while the other played Nesta. Malondi was playing Deshin, as Chaxmi and Prasala watched over their shoulders. She has diving practice this afternoon, but she thought I'd like to come and see. The girls were whispering to us about the game over breakfast. Whispering? Warwick looked up with confusion etched over his features. As he struggled for the right words, he remembered to cant his head. Why are you whispering about playing chess? It's sort of a first rule in the class, like, Kellock froze, as her insides turned to ice. She almost mentioned the chocolate. Like, we want to be discreet. We just want to be discreet. About you, I mean. After you gave the marriage fundamentals seminar, girls would come piling in here if they heard you had an open club. Oh, I suppose that makes sense, he said warily, as she looked at him with concern. He didn't seem to be his usual self. I do appreciate you girls watching out for me when we go into town. I guess I'm still getting used to all of everything. You're welcome. I'm glad you let us, Kellock nodded. I'm starting to see how different it must be for you, but it's just being sensible. I suppose... Say, can I ask you for some advice? He said, advancing one of the desk head pieces. You're a reporter, aren't you? What? Why would you say that? Mavert told me you'd be working with the student video blog. Taking over the campus newscast sounds pretty impressive. Me? I was born before email was a thing in my world. He shrugged. I could use some advice from someone with more media savvy than I have. It doesn't take much, and I think I used up all my favours with the legal department this morning, even if they did seem to have a really good time. It can't be that bad. 3 of them are a Dixie. He grimaced and shook his head. I have to say, they really enjoy their work. I mean, they're keen, good at what they do, but right now I'll take any friendly advice I can get first. Oh, so what's the problem exactly? Kerlock's heart was still pounding, and she willed herself to sound calm. She reached over and opened her tote bag, pulling out her Omnipad. It was still recording. I don't know, maybe it's something I can look up? It's nothing like that. You heard my question to Minister early on the other morning? Oh, goddess, yes! Calm, girl, calm. Do you feel badly about it? Maybe an apology? He looked up sharply. No, I'm not apologizing for what I asked. It was a fair question. He hesitated, before shaking his head. Sorry, I didn't mean to get snappy. No, I've just had a couple of folks reach out to me. They're from something called the CIR, the Campaign for Interspecies Rights. I've heard of them. They have a much bigger presence out in the sector worlds than here on Chill, but they're a pretty vocal group. She bit her lip, considering the best way to avoid offense. They're not, well thought of by everyone. People in the government don't have a lot of good things to say about them. People in power very rarely have anything good to say about changing the status quo. He shook his head ruefully. It's not that I don't agree with promoting equality, but they want me to disrupt the convocation this shell, and that's just going too far. They acted as if the only thing a human can do is cause problems, which is pretty ironic. So, you don't want to cause a problem, Kerlock said carefully. It was for the record, even if it wasn't on the record. What do you want, then? I guess. I want to stand by my rights, but not at the cost of alienating her. She's done a lot for people of all species all over the Empire, humans included. Warwick grimaced briefly. There has to be a way to show that I agree with her policies, even if I don't fully agree with her practice. Well, you know the old adage. She offered a smile. This wasn't going to be so tricky after all. Oceans seem like barriers until you learn to swim them together. Honestly, I've never heard that one before.
Oh. Well, you agree with what she is doing, but not the way she's doing it? You should find a way to visibly show you support her.
She looked down at the board. She'd forgotten whose move it was, but it didn't matter.
People can disagree all the time in families, business, anything. Look, when you get there.
Pod 3 was out in the field, wandering the campus between the perimeter and the objective's dorm. There was a period of silence scheduled for the Empress's departure, and morning classes had been cancelled. On a normal evening, students would have been out on the beach or having parties in their rooms, but tonight, the campus was quiet. Any night when Warwick and Pelavon weren't sharing a room made for a quiet night for the girls of Pod 6. Sergeant Kalani sighed as another minute ticked by.
Are you going to move?
I'm thinking, Sergeant Vaco muttered.
It's not like anything is happening out there, and we have all night to play. There are 6 hours left in our shift, Kalani snorted, and rubbed her forehead in agitation. At this rate, we'll get in 1 game, maybe. Use the time you're given to plan any battle.
Vaco didn't even look up from the board.
If you have 5 hours... Oh, come on.
Do you think she's going to break up with him? Captain Solani glanced over from the monitoring station.
Pelavon? Break up with Warwick?
Kalani looked at her captain in shock.
Are you kidding? She's Myth, but she can't be that stupid.
He did kind of make her look bad, Vaco offered.
Not that bad.
Kalani stared at her podmate, then quickly checked none of the pieces had been moved.
They haven't been together in bed all week, Solani shrugged. There hasn't been a floor show in days.
We can't look into his bedroom,
Kalani said stubbornly, as she scowled at the game board. He was at her place the other night. Yeah, but it didn't sound like they had a good night. Kalani chewed her bottom lip, watching Veiko finger a piece. After a week of going cold clam, you don't think she's actually going to let him go, do you, Captain? I don't know, Solani said casually. We are getting rotated into the field next semester. I was just thinking, if he was free... You don't think he's too old? Veiko cantered ahead, as she moved her priestess across the board. Bedroom? Living room? Solani said, laconically, as she swiveled back to check the boards. Don't forget that night in the kitchen. All right, maybe not. Veiko started to blush. A couple of times a night? Her mother was leaving. As Melondi, it would have hurt. There should be tearful farewells and embraces with her mothers. That was the way normal families went about things. Not that the death of a family member would mean a state funeral, but that was the world for Princess Kalira. As Melondi, all the bonds of warmth and family to dispel the grief were gone, because, in truth, they had never been there. To imagine otherwise was grasping at phantoms of smoke, wisps of reality that straining fingers could never embrace, but she knew they were real. For her friends, they were real. As Melondi, they would have been real. As Princess Kalira Tassu of the Shilvanti Imperium, the obligations of the moment were a matter of routine for her mother, and her older, recognized siblings. While the loving message from her mother had been unexpected, it seemed unsupportable. How could she feel anything but detached from her own sense of loss? The real difference was that, as Kalira, the loss was for the death of her illusions. This is selfish. What about my mother's pain? But that was it. It was her mother's pain. She had loved Kalandri, but to imagine that her sense of loss was comparable to her mother's was the worst kind of self-indulgence. She only had what she could remember. Scraps of memory of her sister, called away more often than not by duty and responsibility. She envied her own alter ego. As loving as the message from her mother had been, Melondi would have had so much more. She watched the shuttle rise higher into the skies. All over Shil, every omnipad, every eye, turned to watch the Empress as she left Shil. It was a holy duty, and unthinkable not to bring Kalandri home. Even a token. It was an obligation of duty, honor, and belief that was as exonerable as the tides. In a few more minutes, other shuttles would rise, bearing Kamordri, another bearing Loral, yet another bearing the court. None of that mattered. Around Shil, the world was silent. Conversations stilled in a sense of communal grief for the Empress as she began the journey. All around the common room, girls stood and watched the vidscreen. There were tears from several, but she had none to offer. Not now. Not yet. I'm alone. In all her life, she'd never felt that before. In a crowded room, in a full academy, on the edge of the capital, on Shil itself, she was alone. Bowing her head, the yawning chasm inside her felt like the deeps, reaching up to drag her down into its abyss. Who was she to think only of herself, now of all times? The apathy of emotional detachment would have been a blessing by comparison, as she closed her eyes, bowing her head against the weight of it. It felt like swimming into the current, submerged in the tides of that communal grief. Who was she to think otherwise? A hand slipped into hers, and she blinked in surprise. Kalira opened her eyes, as another settled onto her shoulder. Turning, she saw Belda on her left, and Deshin resting her hand on her right. The time of silence would go on, enduring until the Empress's shuttle left the atmosphere. But they were there, her friends. Their eyes were on her, with her. Not alone. Sis, you can't keep ducking out on me. Liam crossed his arms and leaned back against the doorframe. I want an answer. An answer about what? Hope turned over her travel bag and rooted through it one more time to make sure everything was packed. I've told you, just stay on campus. It's only one shell and I'll be back the evening after tomorrow. That's not what I meant and you know it, he said sharply, as he hunched against the door and crossed his arms. Belder, you treat her like shit, and I've been waiting for an explanation. If you're not going to give me one, well, maybe you don't have one to give, but I want to see her again. You can't do that, she said crossly, slamming closed the lid on her day bag and sighing in pure exasperation. Liam, I've explained what a third date means. Look, I'll be back before you know it, and we'll... No, Hope! Come on! I've had enough! He shook his head. I've waited ever since Belder left for you to tell me what's eating you, and you just keep brushing me off. Hope watched him, gathering her composure before she tried again. Liam, you aren't ready for that kind of commitment. I don't know if I am or not, but when did my life... Do you want to go back to your cousin? He can't even take care of himself, much less you. She turned away, zipping up the day bag. No, we aren't talking about this. Yes, we are. I have a right to... You don't remember! Hope barely stopped herself from screaming, as she whirled to face her brother. You were too young. You don't remember any of it. When they landed. And what happened to Mum. And now with Dad gone, just... No! Liam looked at her for a long time, as she felt her heart pounding, before he canted his head, just like a Shilvanti. Sis, I'm almost 18. I know you've done your best for me. God, I love you for all you've done to take care of me, sis. But you can't hold on to me like I'm 10 years old forever. Not anymore. You're not 18 yet. You've only been here for weeks and you don't understand. You think, help me then. Liam uncrossed his arms and walked over. It wasn't fair that he'd gotten taller than her, but he stopped by the bag, looking down at it, before looking up at her. She's a great girl, and you know it. Liam, You're just... She looked down at her feet. You're the only family I have left. You just got here. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I don't want to lose you. You're never going to lose me. He reached out and plonked his hat on her head. So, help us both figure it out. Please? Professor Warwick, now that we've checked in for the convocation, I wondered if I might have a word. Garnier nodded to Mavere, then looked back at Tom. I'm quite certain that Miv can take your baggage up while you and I have a brief word. Warwick seemed to fortify himself, but nodded at Mavere, before stepping over to Garnier's side, and they watched Miv head up the corridor for a few moments. Professor, I believe you've had a rather remarkable week. You have once again demonstrated an unforeseen vista of ingenuity in expanding the students' perspectives in the most unexpected fashion. Warwick looked at her warily, proving he was far from dim. At the same time, you have managed to ruin a quiet week for a distinguished guest of the Academy, and a personal friend of mine. She arched an eyebrow at him, her tone growing peremptory. In that, you've amply demonstrated how a devoted and sincere academic can become over-focused to the point of risking their objectivity, if not verging into obsession. I hope you didn't pull me aside just to insult me, Head Administrator. Warwick seemed to develop a sudden fascination with examining his shoes. I feel bad enough about all of this as it is. Do allow me to finish. I have no interest or intention to insult you, merely to point out that Minister Earleon is a duchess, a woman of honor and devotion to the needs of others. She is also a woman of tradition, Professor Warwick, used to commanding her ministry as much as any admiral to command a fleet into battle. To that end, her focus has never wavered from her greater goals. Now, as it happens, before we left, I had a rather enlightening conversation with our legal department. Garnier watched flickers of confusion and
mortification chase over his features. As well they might. In something of a milestone, I can honestly say that in all of my years, I have never seen that particular department quite so entertained. You created a dilemma, but you exercised due consideration toward a resolution, all while pursuing an honest exchange of ideas. And yes, I have made certain that the minister knows it as well. She watched Warwick's mouth fall open briefly before he caught himself. That makes this convocation an opportunity, Professor Warwick. I hope you'll make the fullest possible use of it. Tom held Miver's hand as the convocation dinner drew to a close. Tomorrow the conference would begin in earnest, to meet with delegations from all over the Imperium and discuss how to improve the lives of students, compare problems and solutions, and try to weave a better whole out of the patchwork of countless worlds. Tonight, it was a time to relax. What was it Kellogg had said? Visible support? As the waiters cleared the tables, music began to play. He reached up, adjusting his collar, and sighed at his suit. Sequins. Head to foot, I'm freaking dressed in sequins. And hey, there's even a camera crew, so I get to be captured for posterity, looking like Churro on a bad day. Tom, would you like to dance? Miver looked over at him with hope in her eyes. Tonight she was in a sleeveless dress, while her hair was worn carefully drawn back over one shoulder, and she looked utterly radiant. Visible support. On camera. I'd like to, Miv, but later. He stifled a sigh, squeezing her hand as he rose. Stepping back from the table, he smiled at the questioning cant of her head. I need it elsewhere. Just for a little bit. I need to make something right. It wasn't that far of a walk to reach his destination soon enough, under the bright lights of the hall. He kept his eyes fixed on his goal, not wanting to know who might be watching. I do not look like a disco ball. I do not. Minister, I know it's rather forward of me, but would you care to dance?